The text message arrived at 3:17 a.m. The buzz of my phone shattered the silence of my Boston brownstone, jolting me out of a restless sleep. For a few seconds, I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding from the sudden noise, my body still heavy with exhaustion. But then I saw it, the glow of the screen, casting an eerie blue light across the room. My husband's name. A message. Maybe he thought I'd be asleep. Maybe the 13-hour time difference from Bali had confused him. Or maybe, most likely, he didn't care. I reached for my phone, my fingers unsteady, my breath shallow. I blinked against the brightness as I read the words that would change everything. Sold our Cape Cod beach house. Transferred all our savings. Starting my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless. LOL. Don't bother calling. Changing my number tomorrow. For a moment, my mind refused to process it. 30 years of marriage, reduced to a single text message. A cruel goodbye punctuated with LOL, as if it were some kind of joke. As if he hadn't just stolen our future, our security, my entire life. I set the phone down, my chest tightening, a hollow ache spreading through me. The room felt suddenly too big, too empty. This wasn't heartbreak. This was betrayal. And yet, I wasn't entirely shocked. Because the truth was, I had seen this coming. Francis had been slipping away for months, slowly at first, then all at once. It started last spring, with his sudden, obsessive commitment to fitness. This was a man who had spent years rolling his eyes at my gentle reminders to watch his cholesterol, who groaned at the thought of exercise. But out of nowhere, he signed up at an elite training gym and started seeing a personal trainer 3 times a week. By summer, it was daily. By fall, he had lost 30 pounds, bought a whole new wardrobe, and was suddenly too busy for dinner at home. "You should be happy for me," he snapped when I questioned him about the mounting credit card charges. "I'm finally taking care of myself." But taking care of himself wasn't the problem. Taking care of someone else was. Jessica. 29 years old. Long blonde hair, impossibly toned, the type of woman who posted inspirational fitness quotes alongside bikini selfies. His personal trainer turned mistress. A woman I had barely noticed at first, except for the fact that her Instagram travel photos always seemed to match up with Francis's so-called business trips. And then there was the money. It started with small things. A password change on our joint checking account. A credit card bill that had twice the usual charges. The business class flight to Singapore that he claimed was for a conference, but that had no return ticket. Then, a real estate listing. A draft email I stumbled upon on his laptop. The subject line, confidential listing, Cape Cod property. The Cape House. My family's home for 4 generations. The place where we spent every summer, where our children had learned to swim, where my parents had renewed their vows on their 50th anniversary. And he was selling it. Behind my back. That was the moment I knew. Francis wasn't just having an affair. He was erasing me. He was stealing everything we had built together, methodically, like a man walking out of a burning house, before setting it on fire. And yet, he thought I wouldn't notice. That was his mistake. Because while he was planning his escape, I was documenting everything. I had spent months watching, waiting, preparing. The credit card statements, the unexplained cash withdrawals, the calls he thought I couldn't hear. I had met with an attorney. I had hired a forensic accountant. So when Francis boarded his flight to Bali, thinking he had finally freed himself from me, thinking I would wake up to an empty bank account and nowhere to go, what he didn't know was, I had already beaten him. I picked up my phone again, my hand steady this time. I typed out a simple, calculated response. Check your account balance. And then, for the first time in months, I smiled. Because Francis Mercer was about to realize just how much he had underestimated me. Have you ever been completely blindsided by someone you trusted? Comment 111 if you felt that pain. Francis had always been meticulous. Practical to a fault. He ran our marriage like a business, and I, without realizing it, had played the perfect employee. I handled the emotional labor, the small things that made our home a home. I remembered birthdays, organized family gatherings, sent thank you notes. I planned vacations, coordinated our social calendar, and made sure our children never felt the weight of financial stress. Francis, meanwhile, handled the money. That had always been our dynamic. I trusted him. Completely. Maybe that was my first mistake. For 30 years, I never questioned the financial arrangement because it worked. Francis was responsible, careful, even frugal at times. He scrutinized every purchase I made, questioning the necessity of a $120 dinner but never blinking at his $900 golf club membership. He monitored our bank statements down to the penny, so much so that I used to joke that he should have been an accountant instead of a corporate executive. Looking back, it was never about money. It was about control. But I didn't see it then. I saw a husband who provided, who made sure we had security, who assured me, "You don't need to worry about this stuff. I've got it handled." And I believed him. Then, last spring, Francis changed. Subtly at first. He became different. At 52, he suddenly cared about his appearance. Not just health, but vanity. The man who once mocked gym rats started waking up at 5 a.m. to exercise. He signed up at Elite Training Solutions, a gym so exclusive it didn't even list prices on its website. 3 days a week became 5. 5 became 7. And with those training sessions came charges. Hundreds of dollars at first. Then thousands. "You should be happy for me," he snapped when I asked about it. "I'm finally taking care of myself." By summer, he had lost 30 pounds. By fall, he had lost his conscience. But I told myself it was just a phase. A midlife crisis, maybe. He was working hard, feeling the pressure of aging, trying to regain some sense of youth. I reasoned with myself, he's allowed to have something for himself. So I ignored the late-night phone calls. The ones he took in his office with the door shut. The ones that ended with a low, satisfied chuckle I hadn't heard in years. I ignored the sudden business trips that never seemed to match his company's schedule. I ignored the password changes to our shared accounts, even when he brushed me off with a casual excuse. "Oh, I was just updating security settings. You know how banks are these days." But the truth was, I did know. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to believe it. Then, one evening in September, I found the email. Francis had been careless, leaving his laptop open in the kitchen while he showered. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't trying to catch him in anything. I was just reaching for the grocery list we kept on the counter when my eyes landed on a subject line that stopped me cold. Confidential listing, Cape Cod property. I clicked. My stomach dropped. He was selling our beach house. The house that had been in my family for 4 generations. The house where our children learned to swim, where we had celebrated countless anniversaries, where my parents had renewed their vows. And he hadn't said a word to me about it. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as I scrolled through the email chain. He had been negotiating the sale for weeks. The buyers were already lined up. The closing was only days away. I confronted him that night. "Francis, what is this?" I held up his laptop, my hands shaking. He barely glanced at the screen. "What does it look like?" "I'm considering our options." "Considering? Without talking to me?" My voice cracked. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Alice, we don't even use the house that much anymore. It's a waste of money." A waste of money. That's what he called the place where our children grew up. I stood there, stunned, watching the man I had loved for 30 years treat me like an obstacle, a problem to be managed. And I realized, this wasn't about the house. This was about something much, much bigger. So, I did what any smart woman would do. I hired a forensic accountant. What he uncovered made my blood run cold. Francis had been moving money for months, small amounts, just below the threshold that would raise suspicion. $8,000 here. $12,500 there. It added up to over $887,000 siphoned into an offshore account. He was leaving me. Not just leaving. Abandoning. Financially erasing me. And he thought I wouldn't notice. He thought I'd wake up one day and realize too late that he had drained everything. That he had taken the money, the house, our savings, our future, and disappeared. He thought I'd be left destitute. But what he didn't know was I had already made my move. With the evidence in hand, I met with Judge Martinez and filed for an emergency asset protection order. Within 24 hours, all joint assets were frozen under court supervision. The bank had flagged the offshore transfers, stopping Francis from taking another cent. And then, I waited. I waited for the 3:17 a.m. text where he thought he had won. I waited for him to wake up in Bali, smug and victorious, thinking he had left me with nothing. I waited for him to check his account and see that he, in fact, had nothing. I had beaten him at his own game. Francis just didn't know it yet. Have you ever sacrificed everything for someone, only to realize they never valued you? Comment 222 if you've been there. I remember the exact moment I realized my husband was planning to destroy me. Not just betray me, not just abandon me, but systematically erase my existence like I had been nothing more than a temporary fixture in his life. It was a Wednesday. A completely normal day, up until it wasn't. I had left work early, a migraine pounding at the edges of my skull. My head throbbed with every step as I fumbled with my keys, desperate to shut out the world for a few hours. All I wanted was to take a painkiller, crawl under the covers, and forget everything for a little while. The house was silent when I stepped inside, the kind of stillness that felt unnatural. I assumed Francis was still at work, and for a brief, blissful moment, I let myself relax. But then I heard it. A voice. His voice. Muffled, low, coming from his office down the hall. At first, I thought nothing of it. Another work call. Another excuse for him to be distant. But then, through the pounding in my skull, I heard a name. Jessica. I froze. Then came the words that would burn themselves into my memory for the rest of my life. Jessica, baby, it's all coming together. The beach house should sell quickly. Alice has no idea. Once that money hits our account, we'll disappear. I stopped breathing. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, my body paralyzed between fight and flight, my mind refusing to believe what it had just heard. I had known about Jessica. I had known about the offshore account. I had even known about the credit card charges and secret withdrawals. But there was something different about hearing it. Hearing his voice, so casual, so confident. Hearing him refer to our marriage, our life, as if it were a disposable thing, an obstacle to be removed. Like I was nothing. I sank down onto the bed, my hands clutching the blanket as if it could anchor me, my body ice cold despite the heat creeping up my throat. I wanted to burst into that office. I wanted to scream at him, throw open the door, force him to look me in the eyes as he said those words again. But I didn't. Because at that moment, something changed in me. The woman I had been, the woman who had loved him unconditionally, who had trusted him blindly, who had believed in the life we had built together, she died right there in that bedroom. And in her place, someone else took over. Someone smarter. Someone ruthless. Someone ready to destroy the man who thought he could erase her. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, my mind racing, replaying every red flag I had ignored over the past year. The late-night phone calls. The business trips. The weight loss. The locked accounts. The way he had slowly, methodically, cut me out of our life while still pretending to be the devoted husband. I had seen it. I had seen all of it. And now, I had proof. By morning, my plan was already forming. Because if Francis wanted a war, he was going to get one. The next day, I called Diane, my attorney. "Freeze everything," I told her, my voice steadier than I expected. She didn't ask questions. She had seen too many cases like mine, women blindsided by husbands who had spent years plotting their escape. "The emergency order is already in place," she assured me. "Francis won't be able to touch a dime without a judge's approval." I exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "And the beach house?" I asked. Voided. A wave of relief crashed over me. Francis thought he had sold it out from under me. He thought I would wake up one day and find my family's home gone. Instead, his sale had been flagged, stopped, before it could be finalized. And he had no idea. I sat in my car outside Diane's office, staring out at the street, feeling something settle deep in my chest. Power. I had been asleep in this marriage for too long, letting Francis dictate the rules while I played the obedient wife. Not anymore. I wasn't going to let Francis destroy me. I was going to destroy his plans first. And the best part? He wouldn't even see it coming. 3 days later, Francis left for Bali. He didn't kiss me goodbye. Didn't even look at me as he wheeled his luggage out the door, muttering something about needing space. I watched from the window, my arms crossed over my chest, my face unreadable. I imagined him on the plane, smug and satisfied, convinced that when he landed, he would be free. That I would be back home, crying in an empty house, penniless and broken, wondering how I had let this happen. I pictured him stepping off that plane, his phone in his hand, checking our account one last time, just for the satisfaction of seeing the zero balance. And I pictured his face when he realized the truth. That I had already won. At exactly 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. I didn't need to look to know who it was from. Francis. I reached for my phone, took a slow breath, and read the message. Sold our Cape Cod beach house. Transferred all our savings. Starting my new life with Jessica. Enjoy being homeless. LOL. Don't bother calling. Changing my number tomorrow. A confession wrapped in cruelty. I stared at the words, the finality of them, the sheer audacity. He really thought he had done it. He really thought I would wake up, check our bank account, and realize I had nothing. He really thought he had outsmarted me. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady, and typed a single reply. Check your account balance. Then, I set my phone down. And I smiled. Because the moment he checked, he would realize the truth. That everything he thought he had stolen was already gone. That his freedom, his fresh start, his perfect new life with Jessica. It was over before it even began. What would you have done in my shoes? Comment 333 and tell me. 4 months, I had played the long game. Not out of fear. Not out of weakness. But because revenge is only satisfying when it's absolute. Francis thought he had been so careful. He thought he had manipulated me into looking the other way while he spent months siphoning away our money, preparing for his grand exit. He thought that by the time I figured it out, it would be too late. But I had known. And I had been preparing, too. The moment Francis left for Bali, thinking he was finally free of me, I put my plan into action. I wasn't emotional. I wasn't reckless. I didn't scream or cry or beg. I simply executed. The first step was freezing our assets. The legal orders had already been in place for weeks, but I had waited. Timing was everything. If I moved too soon, he would have had a chance to react, to pivot. But by letting him think he had won, I ensured that when I struck, he wouldn't have any backup plans left. The second step was revoking his access to our accounts. Francis had been so sure of himself that he didn't check his accounts immediately after sending that cruel text. He was still sleeping in his luxury Bali resort, still dreaming of his perfect new life with Jessica, completely unaware that every single financial transaction he had attempted that morning had failed. I imagined the moment he finally checked. The moment the reality of his own downfall settled in. The joint accounts? Frozen. The offshore transfers? Reversed. The beach house sale? Voided. I wondered if his hands had started shaking when he realized he had nothing. If his stomach had dropped the way mine had when I first discovered what he was planning. If, just for a second, he felt the kind of powerlessness he had wanted for me. But Francis was arrogant. He wouldn't believe it at first. He would assume it was a mistake, a glitch in the system. Until he tried again. Until every login attempt failed. Until he realized that the life he had planned for himself was already gone. I didn't hear from him for hours after I sent that text. No immediate response. No frantic follow-up. Just silence. That told me everything I needed to know. Francis had always been quick to anger, quick to call, quick to try to manipulate his way back into control. But for the first time, he was out of moves. And I wasn't going to give him an inch. So I waited. The entire day passed, my phone eerily silent. I went about my routine as if nothing had happened, made coffee, answered work emails, even took a long walk by the river. I didn't let myself sit around waiting for his meltdown, because I knew it was coming. I didn't need to see it happen. I had already won. That night, at 9:42 p.m., my phone finally rang. Francis. I let it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then, I answered. I could hear it immediately. The panic. His breathing was uneven, ragged. There was none of the confidence, none of the smug arrogance from his 3:17 a.m. text. Alice, what the hell did you do? I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the moment. Good evening, Francis. I see you finally checked the accounts. Silence. Then, a sharp inhale. You had no right. I had every right, I cut him off, my voice calm, measured. You were planning to steal everything from me. I simply got there first. He made a noise, somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. You think you're clever, don't you? You can't stop me, Alice. The money is mine. The house is mine. I smiled, even though he couldn't see me. Actually, neither of those statements are true. I let the words hang in the air, let the weight of them settle over him like a suffocating fog. Then, I twisted the knife. The bank has already reversed the offshore transfers. The emergency court order was granted weeks ago. Every cent you tried to steal is now legally frozen. And as for the beach house? The buyers were kind enough to withdraw after I sent them the court paperwork. His breathing turned ragged. And then, in the background, I heard Jessica's voice. What's going on? Francis, what does she mean? I could almost picture it. Jessica, standing there in her luxury Bali resort, realization dawning on her face. Realization that Francis wasn't the wealthy, successful man she thought he was. Realization that she had backed the wrong horse. Francis let out a bitter laugh, but it wasn't real. It was forced, desperate. You have no idea what you've done. Oh, I know exactly what I've done, Francis. I let my voice drop lower, colder. I've made sure you will never be able to hurt me again. And then, I hung up. Just like that. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Francis called 17 more times that night. I didn't answer. The next morning, his brother Michael called me instead. He's unraveling, Alice. His voice was low, wary. He's saying some wild things. You might want to prepare yourself. I smiled, even though Michael couldn't see me. Oh, I'm prepared. That afternoon, Jessica called me. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. Mrs. Mercer, she started, her voice tightly controlled, as if she were pretending this wasn't humiliating for her. Jessica, I greeted her smoothly. A pause. Then. Francis lied to me. I didn't reply. She exhaled sharply. He told me the beach house was his. That you two had already separated. That the money was his alone. I still said nothing. I wouldn't have. But you did, Jessica. Silence. Then, quietly, I just thought you should know that I'm done with him. He's not who I thought he was. I almost laughed. She thought I needed her pity? I ended the call before she could say another word. The next morning, my attorney called. Alice, we have a problem. I sat up straighter. What kind of problem? Francis is trying to access accounts under different credentials. He's even attempted to contact the buyers of the beach house, trying to push through the sale anyway. I felt a sharp, cold thrill. Did he now? It's actually a good thing, legally speaking. It shows intent to violate the court orders. This is exactly what we need to lock things down further. I smiled. Perfect. Because Francis hadn't learned his lesson yet. But he was about to. Because the next phase of my plan was just beginning. Have you ever had to stay silent while planning your revenge? Comment 444 if you know that feeling. At 4:02 a.m., my phone rang. I had been expecting it. I had gone to bed knowing that at some point in the night, Francis would check his accounts, see the disaster unfolding before him, and panic. Still, I let the phone ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th, I answered. The silence on the other end lasted a beat too long, and then, finally, his voice came through, ragged, furious, and laced with barely concealed panic. Alice, what the hell did you do? I leaned back against my pillows, taking my time, letting the moment stretch. Good morning, Francis, I said, my tone almost pleasant. I see you checked the accounts. He let out a breath, one that sounded more like a snarl. This is my money. I almost laughed. Our money, I corrected, calm, unbothered. From our 30-year marriage. And legally, it stays right where it is. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, the weight of reality pressing down on him like a vice. I could picture him pacing across some luxury Bali resort suite, sweat beading at his temples, his phone clenched in a trembling grip. Jessica, probably still asleep, unaware that the foundation beneath their perfect escape was already crumbling. And then he snapped. You conniving, he cut himself off, struggling to rein in his anger. You can't do this. You won't get away with this. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Francis, I said, coolly, if you truly believe that, then I suggest you hire a very good lawyer. In the meantime, you might want to explain to Jessica why your dream of running off into the sunset just went up in flames. I heard movement in the background, a rustling of sheets, a muffled female voice. She was waking up. Perfect. Alice, Francis started again, this time his voice lower, pleading, desperate to regain some control. This is insane. Look, we don't have to do this. Just let's talk, okay? Let's figure this out like adults. I let that hang in the air for a moment before I said, slowly, you mean like how you texted me that I should enjoy being homeless? A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Checkmate. I hung up. By the time the sun rose, Jessica had left him. I received confirmation from a source I hadn't expected, his brother, Michael. She packed up and left before breakfast, Michael told me when he called later that morning. I guess she realized she was wasting her time. I pictured it, Jessica waking up to Francis's frantic pacing, the conversation that must have followed. What do you mean you can't access the money? What do you mean the beach house sale fell through? Jessica had never signed up for a man with nothing. She had been in it for the money, the status, the escape. And when it all vanished overnight, so did she. I wondered if Francis had begged her to stay. If he had tried to spin a new lie, promise her that he would fix this. But Jessica wasn't stupid. She cut her losses and ran. That was the first domino to fall. The next morning, my lawyer called. Diane, I greeted smoothly. Tell me something good. "Oh, I have plenty," she replied, the satisfaction in her voice evident. Frances had spent the entire night scrambling, trying everything, attempting to access accounts, reaching out to offshore banks, even calling the buyers of the beach house, begging them to push the sale through anyway. But the banks had blocked him. The buyers had cut ties. The judge had already signed the emergency injunction, meaning every single financial move he tried to make was under scrutiny. He even tried to use an alias to access one of the offshore accounts, Diane added. The forensic team flagged it immediately. The court is going to love that one. I let out a slow, satisfied breath. Francis wasn't just losing, he was burying himself deeper with every desperate attempt. By the third day, I knew he was breaking. His calls went from furious demands to pleading. "Alice, come on," he tried on the fourth attempt that afternoon. 30 years. Doesn't that count for something? I felt nothing. It did, I said, voice icy cold. That's why I documented everything. That's why I'll see you in court. Another silence. I could hear him breathing, like he was struggling to keep himself together. He had thought he was untouchable. He had thought I would roll over and accept my fate. Instead, I had turned the tables so thoroughly that he was unrecognizable. Just a man in a foreign country, alone, penniless, watching everything he built collapse in real time. I let that sink in for a few seconds before I said, "You should start thinking about where you're going to live when you get back. Because it won't be here." And then, once again, I hung up. The next 48 hours unraveled his life in ways even I hadn't expected. His company, the one he had worked at for over 2 decades, caught wind of the financial scandal. Someone had leaked details of the fraud investigation. By the end of the week, he was fired. His reputation, once untouchable, was now in tatters. And then, as if to seal his fate, the final blow came. Michael called me again, this time sounding reluctant. He booked a flight back to Boston, he said. He lands tomorrow night. I took a slow breath. Good. Then he can face the consequences in person. Michael sighed. Alice, he's got nowhere to go. No job. No money. That's not my problem, I cut in. He made his choices. Now he gets to live with them. Michael didn't argue. Because there was nothing left to say. Francis's downfall was complete. Jessica was gone. His money was gone. His career, his status, the life he thought he was entitled to, all gone. And I had done it all in silence. No screaming. No begging. No fighting. Just strategy, patience, and execution. Because when a man spends months planning how to destroy you, you let him believe he's won. And then you take everything from him instead. Do you think he got what he deserved? Comment 555 if you agree. The day the judge finalized my divorce, I woke up early. Not because I was nervous, or because I dreaded the hearing, but because I wanted to watch the sunrise. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up with the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing down on my chest. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop, no more second-guessing myself, no more wondering if I was losing my mind. That morning, as the soft pink light crept over the city skyline, I realized something profound. I was free. I didn't need the court's ruling to tell me that. But having it in writing sure as hell helped. Francis had walked into the courtroom with the same arrogance he had always carried, but by the time he walked out, he was a broken man. His desperate attempts to circumvent court orders had backfired spectacularly. He had lost the house. The accounts. His career. The very foundation he had built his entire life upon. And I had lost him. But as I sat there, watching the sky shift from soft pinks to a golden orange, I realized that losing Francis wasn't actually a loss at all. It was a gift. In the weeks following the divorce, I gave myself permission to grieve. Not for Francis, but for the version of myself who had spent so many years sacrificing for a man who never deserved it. I grieved for the girl who had fallen in love with a man she thought would protect her. I grieved for the young wife who had trusted her husband to always have her back. And most of all, I grieved for the woman who had ignored her own instincts for far too long. I allowed myself to sit with the pain. To feel it. To acknowledge it. But I refused to let it consume me. Instead, I channeled my energy into something productive. I started with the house. For weeks, I had avoided the Cape Cod beach house, unsure if I could walk through those doors without feeling the sting of betrayal. That house had been a battleground, a symbol of everything Francis had tried to take from me. But when I finally went back, something unexpected happened. It didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like mine. I spent the first weekend there alone, something I had never done before. I walked along the shore, letting the icy waves lap at my feet. I repainted the kitchen, changed the locks, and replaced every single item that reminded me of him. By the end of the weekend, the house no longer felt like a ghost of our past. It felt like the start of my future. With Francis officially out of my life, I began reclaiming the parts of myself I had long abandoned. I started reading again. Not just the kind of books that Francis used to scoff at, but books that set my soul on fire. I reconnected with old friends, people I had slowly drifted away from over the years, not because I wanted to, but because being with Francis had always been easier when I isolated myself. I started saying yes to things that scared me. An invitation to a weekend retreat? Yes. A solo trip to Paris, something I had always dreamed of but never thought I'd do alone? Yes. Taking a painting class, even though I hadn't picked up a brush since college? Yes. I had spent so many years accommodating someone else's needs, making myself smaller, duller, easier to digest. Now? I was learning how to be big again. Of course, Francis wasn't done trying to weasel his way back into my life. It started with emails. Long-winded explanations, rewritten histories, feigned remorse. Alice, I never meant to hurt you. Alice, I made a mistake. Alice, can we just talk? Then, when I didn't respond, the emails turned angry. Alice, you ruined my life. Alice, I hope you know what you've done. Alice, you'll regret this. But the truth was, I didn't regret a single thing. I ignored every message. Because I had finally realized that Francis didn't deserve a response. He had lost access to me the moment he made the choice to steal from me, to betray me, to reduce me to a disposable inconvenience. He had been so sure that I would crumble, that I would take him back, that I would give him another chance to manipulate his way back into my life. But he was wrong. Because I was no longer the same woman he had tried to destroy. I was stronger. And he would never break me again. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, I found myself standing in front of a packed auditorium. I had been invited to speak at a seminar on financial security after betrayal, a topic I never thought I would become an expert on. But as I looked out at the crowd, a sea of women, many of whom had been through their own versions of my story, I realized that everything I had endured had led me to this moment. Preparation isn't paranoia, I told them. And documentation isn't distrust. They're forms of self-protection. I spoke about trusting your instincts. About the warning signs so many of us ignore. About the importance of financial independence, even in relationships that feel secure. And at the end of the seminar, as I stood by the exit, a woman approached me. She had tears in her eyes. My husband is planning something similar, she whispered. I can feel it. And after hearing you speak today, I know what I need to do. I squeezed her hand. Because that was the moment I knew I had won. Francis had tried to ruin me. Instead, he had given me a new purpose. He had wanted me powerless. Instead, he had taught me how to be unstoppable. And I have never looked back. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you love to protect yourself? Comment 666 if you've been there. A year ago, I thought my life was over. Not just the life I had built with Francis, but the life I had envisioned for myself, the stability, the security, the future I had worked so hard to create. I had spent decades believing that loyalty, sacrifice, and patience would be enough to keep a marriage strong. That if I just gave more, compromised more, forgave more, everything would eventually balance out. I was wrong. Because no amount of sacrifice can fix a relationship built on deception. No amount of love can redeem a person who has already decided to betray you. And no amount of waiting will turn a selfish man into someone who values you. The day I discovered Francis's betrayal, I thought I had lost everything. But in reality, I was given something I hadn't had in years, a second chance. A chance to rebuild. A chance to reclaim my power. A chance to put myself first for once in my life. Walking away wasn't easy. Healing wasn't immediate. There were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the memories crept in, when I questioned everything. But each day, I woke up and made a choice, to keep moving forward, to rebuild, to become the woman I had almost forgotten I was. The woman who didn't beg for respect. The woman who didn't shrink herself for a man who only saw her as an afterthought. The woman who knew her worth. And now, standing in front of a room full of women, sharing my story, helping others see the warning signs I ignored, I know that everything I went through wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has ever been deceived, manipulated, or discarded like they were nothing. Because the truth is, we are never nothing. We are stronger than the people who betray us. We are more resilient than the men who think they can break us. And when we take back our power, when we walk away from the people who don't deserve us, we don't just survive, we thrive. Francis? He lost everything. His wealth. His reputation. The life he thought he was entitled to. He now teaches business ethics at a community college. The irony of that never fails to amuse me. He thought he could erase me, but instead, he erased himself. I have no hate left for him. Just indifference. Because my life is mine now. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: choosing yourself is not selfish. It is survival. So now, I ask you, have you ever had to fight to reclaim your power? Have you ever walked away from someone who tried to break you, only to find yourself stronger than ever? I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, because your voice matters. And if you found strength in this story, if it resonated with you in any way, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, survival, and taking back control. Because no one, not a cheating husband, not a liar, not a manipulator, gets to decide your worth. Only you do.